When people say that there isn't a cartoon that does that, or there haven't been enough of these cartoons, more likely than not, they couldn't be farther from the truth. There is quite literally a cartoon for everything, whether it's from 2019 or 1919. As harebrained as it seems, there's a reason why people call the new decade's worth of animated media derivative. Considering how far back the history of the medium spans, there's pretty much no topic left uncovered. That's not a diss either, that's quite the accomplishment. There's so many cartoons worth looking at that get overlooked. Surprisingly, even if there is one worth a deep dive, oftentimes there might not be enough material to sustain a true review of it. So I wanted to start this series for cartoons just like that, stuff that's worth talking about, but might not sustain a modest discussion on their own. Each volume will cover 3 to 5 topics of discussion or review, and today we're covering PBS Kids' exclusive lineup of Nelvana adaptations from the late 90s and early 2000s. So for Christmas I purchased this book called The Nelvana Story 30 Animated Years, which takes us through the history of the Canadian animation studio from conception up till the turn of the century, when the book was authored. It does a great job of establishing the risks and challenges associated with starting up the studio and the chronology of building it up. And that's pretty much its only strong suit. Being published in the early 2000s is obviously not up to date with Nelvana's transition into more of a distributor in later years, not to mention its general glossing over of various properties from the 90s and such. Despite having the longest chapter in the book, the Nelvana properties of the 90s generally didn't get as much coverage as ones previous. Granted, there were a lot more of them during that time, but we breezed past a lot of them. The cover has this cool collage of a bunch of Nelvana characters where they get their own tiles on a blue background. Some characters are highlighted, but most of them are behind the scenes looking cute, which ironically mimics how this book was written. I don't really need a 90-page thesis on how Braceface came to be, but a little more exposition on them would have been nice. Anyway, one creator they focused on a bit was William Joyce, the dude whose books inspired movies such as Meet the Robinsons, Rise of the Guardians, and Epic. Long before those projects were developed, Joyce was slowly but surely convinced by a Nelvana executive to adapt 2 of his books to hit the silver screen, Roly Poly Oly and George Shrinks. I remember enjoying both series when I was younger, but the latter in particular piques my interest in the present day. The book elaborates on Nelvana's 90s expansion process, which involves selling exclusive blocks of programming to networks with failing or non-existent Saturday morning blocks and beefing up their ratings, the latter of which belonged to one. In September of 2000, PBS Kids launched the preschool-oriented TV block Bookworm Bunch, full of vibrant adaptations of classic kids' books. Not only did it serve to promote the Nelvana name and library, but it also kind of served as a de facto literacy campaign for PBS Kids. Despite being aimed at the youngest demographic, some of the series had a special appeal of their own, so I looked through and picked 4 cartoons to talk about. I have nostalgic experience with 2 of these series, while the other 2 were new to me upon researching them, such as Corduroy. Truth be told, I can't say this series gripped me. It's not bad, it's just a bit dull. Corduroy is based off the 1968 book of the same name, about a stuffed bear in a department store being bought by this girl named Lisa. Because of its open-ended nature, it had several adaptations before the PBS series, including a 97 HBO series and a TV movie from 1984. Unlike the former, which seemed to be a prequel series, and the latter, which seemed to strictly retell the events of the original book, this series follows the events immediately after. In self-contained adventures, the series follows Corduroy as he learns about the world around him with help from Lisa and the other toys. This series is a bog-standard edutainment cartoon, the kind of show made to sneak in fun little lessons in self-contained adventures, except significantly more dull. I'm not particularly surprised that Corduroy didn't interest me at all, but I am surprised with how boring it seems to be. The episodes are rendered with really straightforward writing and art direction, so there's not much left to the imagination as to what'll happen each episode. The art style's a bit more realistic than the other block entries, but it's utilized the thick outlines of more animated entries. The closest comparison to be made would probably be to Caillou, with 70% less mind-crushing nagging from said young protagonist. The relationships aren't particularly complex or nuanced, and while that's partially attributed to the series' attempt to portray real problems experienced by the target demo, the final product still ends up significantly less fantastical and mentally stimulating than they normally are. In the writer's quest to portray the life and times of a magical sentient bear, they've made that universe out to be more boring than everyday life. Here's the thing about preschool cartoons. Since most of them eagerly take up the mantle of edutainment, we can't judge them on the same level we do Cartoon Network properties, because they almost always have to balance the simplicity to teach concepts and the energy to engage its viewers. It's plain to see that the writers of Dora the Explorer had different goals and objectives than the writers of SpongeBob, so it's not fair to stack their final products against each other because they're made from different parts. Most PBS series of the time weaved their educational concepts into relevant stories instead of building around them, so it's crucial the stories themselves be solid so the audience can learn from them. Now, because I'm decidedly outside the age range that Corduroy was tailored for, my perspective on its entertainment value is not entirely useful in fixing it, but I do wonder how well the target audience copped to it. It was one of the Bookworm Bunch's first cancellations on the block. While all the series in question were made as standalone products, the block's success found most of them being renewed for additional seasons, excluding this one. Of course, there are always multiple factors that contribute to a cancellation, but simply put, this one is boring and they had better picks. Such as
the Berenstain Bears.
Berenstain Bears. Okay, so technically this one wasn't part of the block proper, but when it went unbranded by the mid-2000s, this show joined the same lineup on weekend mornings. And it is a Nelvana adaptation, so it fits. Sort of. I first watched this series when I was younger, and from my experiences with it back then and now, it largely holds up from when I first saw it. Not only does the show function as an adequate adaptation to many of the books, but it's almost as engaging as the Hanna-Barbera Berenstain series. I feel like the idea to make a Berenstain Bears cartoon was one of the easiest decisions to make twice over, because the books, while usually criticized for their smarmy traditionalist nature, were largely accessible to kids and families of all sizes. Looking at the two cartoons side by side, not much has changed with the 03 series, aside from a more grounded tone and less lively soundtrack. The Bears and the Naughties felt slightly more in line with the books, as it was notably adapted for the younger kids, so it was made to be a bit more soft and slow to accommodate. Trust me, that doesn't detract much from the source material. If anything, it probably adds to it. The animation work is pretty clean and looks close to, if not more, on model than the books did. The voice work is good and matches not only the homely feel of the universe, but the original animated interpretations of the characters. Hearing the two back-to-back was an out-of-body experience, realizing that they just copied the vocal qualities of the original cast and got less expensive, more Canadian imitators to do them again, which is rather impressive. I can't necessarily blame them. The books they adapt essentially function as story outlines, so once dialogue is done away with, there's not much else to add to the creative process. It might have been a decision made to keep the new series as well received as the original. Something I learned about Berenstain Bears was that it had a lot of street cred in the 80s and continued to be relevant in North American pop culture even today. The Nelvana series was even dubbed especially in Lakota to preserve its linguistic ties, which is a really cool project in and of itself. I don't have much to say about it, it's just a respectable cartoon. But overall, there's more imaginative entries in the Nelvana library, such as
George rings, George rings, George rings, George rings.
George Shrinks. This is the first series of this anthology I've seen when I was practically a little zygote. As mentioned before, this along with Roly Poly Oly became adapted into animated preschool series in the late 90s and went on to be memorable entries to their respective categories. And like many Nelvana adaptations, it did well to keep with the aesthetic and composition of the source material. Both original books are set or are themed around the 50s, and as such take on attributes of the time. It really hammers in that topical slang. 80% of George's dialogue is made up of pithy catchphrases and puns, which I guess works well for a plucky 3-inch tall hero that just rolls with the punches, daddy-o. This series seems to really put itself out there artistically. In keeping with its retro style, the score is mainly composed of smooth jazz, including that theme song. George's folks are artists of sorts too. His dad's a musician and part-time tinkerer, and his mom is a visual artist. So we can squarely place this family in primo hippie territory right off the bat. It's so realistic. There's such a whimsical tone to their adventures that it's really no biggie that their son is no larger than a cockroach. George Shrinks is all about emphasizing imaginative but flexible problem-solving techniques and patience, so its characters wholly embody those traits in the most delightful of ways, even if it does damage your suspension of disbelief a little bit. I mean, it's not the first story about a really small family member working to live a normal life in a giant world, but it's one of the more articulated entries in that category, to say the least. The art style is in keeping with this theme and was a nice compromise between efficiency and authenticity. The book tends to do establishing and ambient shots better than the cartoon, but the latter makes up for it in its arsenal of 50s slang. It's your standard Nelvana adaptation, which means that it's pretty great. This entry is good, but only one entry could steal my attention today. And that would happen to be
7 little monsters, 7 little monsters, 7 little monsters.
7 Little Monsters. So I watched this series a year or two ago. I just stumbled across it randomly, and I ended up enjoying it the most by a landslide. I have no idea what the original Sendak classic was like, but I just love what they did with this series. See, this is what Corduroy could have had, or really wish it had, because this is not only one of the longest lasting series in the Bookworm Bunch, but it is hands down one of the most entertaining as well. Premise is simple. There's 7 monsters that live in a giant shoe with an ambiguously Slavic woman, and they're basically her children, and they have adventures in their town or not, but either way, it's always a fun time. In this house, we stand an adaptation with executive approval. In really engaging preschool series, usually the characters have to stand on their own 2 feet and shine, and there's no shortage of that here. I feel like each of the 7 monsters are constantly fighting for the spotlight, unintentionally so, but they're all just so compelling. It helps that the humor and writing is a bit more energetic and kind of edgy than its constituents, but has basically learned how to tame controlled chaos in a show for 2 to 5-year-olds. The flow of character interaction is so natural, but so gut-bustingly funny, that it sucks you in long before the story even starts. It's amazing because, despite pretty much being demoted to school-aged children in mentality, the monsters maintain likability as a cohesive unit or as a disjointed pack. The animation doesn't always stack up to the written comedy gold, but rest assured it's not much of a distraction. The visual staging is pretty well done though, regardless of how well the actual characters move. It's clear the world building is taken seriously in fleshing out this universe. Though the book obviously does well as a standalone story, its existence is enhanced by what the show has to offer. Its scripts are probably some of the best preschool edutainment I've ever seen, and ultimately functions as the quintessential way to do it. The lessons taught are usually common sense proverbs, so nobody's left out, but the way they chose to teach such by example is always a hell of a time. I would occasionally put this on as a casual watch, or even binge it without getting tired of it. I imagine the occasional musical stylings could get to some viewers, but to me, they come and go and they don't disrupt the flow of the story, especially when the general absurdity of the action has to stay relevant. Its morals are standard, but the way it teaches, and more importantly how it entertains, is extremely engaging, and the spirit of the show is light and infectious. It's a really strong adaptation. In keeping with the last volume, I really came to appreciate some unexpected cartoons and tap back into that nostalgic sense of being. Not all of them can hit the mark, but when they do, they really hit it out of the park. After all, Nelvana was the king of adaptation of cartoons once upon a time, and while their reputation hasn't exactly maintained to the same degree, it's nice to know a fair amount of their programming still holds up today.